Lakeland Currents, your public affairs program for North Central Minnesota. Production funding for Lakeland Currents is made possible by Bemidji Regional Airport, serving the region with daily flights to Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport. More information available at bemidjiairport.org. Closed captioning for Lakeland Currents is sponsored by Nisswa Tax Service, tax preparation for businesses and individuals. Online at nisswatax.com.
Hello again, friends. I'm Jason Edens, your host of Lakeland Currents. Thanks for joining the conversation today, and thanks for your ongoing support of Lakeland Public TV. Today, we're going to peer behind the curtain at our own station, Lakeland Public Broadcasting. More specifically, we're going to learn about the legacy and lessons learned of Bill Sanford, Lakeland's CEO and Director of Engineering. After 35 years of service, Bill will be retiring this year, and I wanted to hear from him directly about his career and philosophy of public broadcasting. Bill, welcome to the program, and thanks for making time for our conversation.
Well, thank you. This will be a lot of fun.
Well, first and foremost, from all the people that you've impacted across the state and beyond, thank you for your service and congratulations on your retirement.
Well, thank you very much. You know, it's been a real privilege to be involved in public television all these years. It's something I think, we're very fortunate here to have the tenure that we do with all of our staff. We've got a very dedicated staff, and they make my job easy, just like you.
Well, I appreciate that. Well, one of the first things I was curious about is, did you choose public broadcasting or did it choose you? Were you intentional when you started your career to find an opportunity in public broadcasting?
My real desire was to work in technology. I went to college and got a degree in industrial technology, but had a lot of electronics and was interested in the broadcast side of electronics. Had done some work for some radio stations. Prior to coming here, I worked for the first low-power television station in the country. Started by a guy named John Bowler, who was out of Fargo. And if you've ever heard of the station KXJB in Fargo, JB is John Bowler, and he owned several broadcast stations throughout North Dakota. And he started the first low-power station in the U.S. here in Bemidji. I'm a Bemidji State grad, so I love this area. Growing up, we used to vacation on Cass Lake. I'm from East Grand Forks, and I really liked the Bemidji area and wanted to stick around here, and was really interested in broadcasting and almost more broadcast engineering, and that's where I started at the station. I was director of engineering when I started back in '85.
Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you there, Bill. You just used a term that I actually have never heard myself. Low power, is that another term to describe smaller broadcasting stations?
Yeah, the FCC kind of did an experiment for a while where they licensed low power stations. The license process was a little easier, and they had several around the country. And the goal with them was to provide really localized local service in different communities. And so John Bowler applied and got the first low power license in the country. This is under a different set of rules than the traditional broadcasters. And that started in Bemidji, and we actually did subscription television service at night. So it was pay TV at night. You needed this set-top box that sat on top of your TV, and you'd pay to watch movies. And during the day, it was like a commercial station. So really a different model, and it really didn't end up panning out financially. It's a pretty sparse rural area up here, and I don't think there was the population base to really make it work. But it was an interesting experiment, and it's where I learned a lot about television. And the director of engineering, or the chief engineer there, ended up taking a job, and I ended up kind of fortunately kind of sliding into that role, and really got thrown to the fire, so to speak, and had to do pretty much everything. And I was pretty young and without a lot of experience, but I learned an awful lot. And then I had the opportunity to, they wanted me to move to Fargo to work with Red River Television. And I actually picked out their studio location that they have now in Fargo, and did some microwave design work, but I was doing it out of Bemidji. I really didn't want to move out of Bemidji. And the director of engineering job opened up at KAWE, which was Channel 9 back then. It wasn't Lakeland PBS or Lakeland Public Television. It was Northern Minnesota Public Television. That's still our corporate name. but I
Oh,
started back
interesting.
in July of '85. So,
Well, you actually, that's a perfect segue because I wanted to ask you, what was Lakeland Public TV, although it wasn't called that at the time? What was it like when you first started?
it was really a totally different animal. There was a lot more focus on educational programming, and we broadcast instructional television programming for a big chunk of the day during the winter. And in the summers, we didn't actually even turn the transmitter on. We turned it on in the morning for something called AM weather, and it was on for, I think, half an hour. And then we actually turned the transmitter off, and we were off the air until like noon or 12:30 or 1, something like that. Then we'd turn it
Really?
back on, and we would air, Sesame Street and some of that kind of stuff. And yeah, it was completely different.
Well, how has your vision for public broadcasting changed over the years? I mean, starting 35 years ago, you've obviously seen quite the evolution.
You know, I think the thing that has changed but has remained the same is really public television and public radio, public media in general is based on service, serving a community. Um, it isn't about how that we can extract the most money out of the community. It's how can
Mm,
we provide good service to the community. And I think that's something that us here at Lakeland PBS are very proud of. We've back in the day when instructional television was really important, we focused on that a lot. Um, Now with media consolidation and local news really drying up in the commercial side of things, it's an area that we've focused on, and it's something that's getting a lot more attention in public television. There's a lot of talk about providing more news and information, but it's a tough thing to do. It's we dedicate an awful lot of our staff to do Lakeland News. And that's certainly not our only program, but a lot of our focus goes into local news programming. Also, we're fortunate to have some funding from the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund
mm.
annually that allows us to do some arts and culture programming. It allows us to do Common Ground, which is really a neat program. It goes, Scott and the crew go out and talk to different artists and feature different art and culture events and look at history, the history of our region. So it's fun to be able to do that as well. But again, the focus really is on serving the community. That's the important thing with public television.
Hmm. Well, you brought up money and funding, and that's certainly something that I wanted to explore with you. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how public broadcasting is funded generally, and then, of course, Lakeland specifically. Then I'm also curious, do you have any concerns or trepidations about long-term funding for public broadcasting?
Um, the funding model is interesting and unique and challenging all at the same time. Um, our funding, we do get some state and federal funding, and that's a significant portion, especially for smaller stations like ours. Um, but those funds are reliant upon local money that we raise. Our state, one of our state grants is a matching grant, and it's based on dollar for dollar match. We have to raise that much to be able to get that grant from the state.
Mm,
Um, Federal portion of the federal grant that we receive is matching as well. But small stations like ours really do rely on state and federal funding. But business support is important as well. If you watch the station between programs, you see support from various businesses throughout the region, and we really appreciate their help. Things that we do just wouldn't be possible without them. And then, of course, viewers like you, people that watch and become members of the station help support Lakeland PBS, help support the programs that they enjoy each and every day.
do you think that public broadcasting will remain a priority for federal funding going forward?
I think if we stay true to our mission, the money will come.
Hmm.
If we're providing important, relevant services to people, if it's important to them and the legislators see that, the funding will come. If
Hmm.
we don't stay true to our mission, the funding will go away. It's that simple.
So do you have to be in St. Paul, for example, in order to advocate for Lakeland in particular, or does public broadcasting work together in order to do that advocacy? How does that work?
We work together to do that. In Minnesota, we have a state association called the Minnesota Public Television Association, and we're
Okay.
a member of that. There's 6 entities that belong to that around the state. One thing that's unique about the state of Minnesota over other states is the fact that each station is independent. We're not a state network. We're not controlled out of one location. So Lakeland PBS, we have our own board of directors. Decisions about what we do, the programs that we air, the local shows that we do are made locally here in Bemidji and Brainerd. And, we have board members from around the region. We've got board member from Park Rapids and, different communities around the area. And they're volunteer board members, and they provide the governance of the organization. I work for the board. The other thing that's interesting that some people don't understand is Lakeland PBS is something called a community licensee, which means that the community is what owns the license, and the community actually owns the organization. It's not owned by anybody. It's not owned by me. It's not owned by the board. It's owned by the community. So we're just caretakers of this organization. Hopefully, when I leave, I've left it in a better state than when I came, and the same goes for the next person that comes along that will manage the organization. One thing though, Jason, that has helped an awful lot is we have just a really good board as well. The board has done a good job. The board is self-appointing, so they appoint new board members themselves, and I've just been so blessed to work for a really great group of people.
So even though each station is independent, is there any collaboration in terms of content or cross-pollination, or even just a sense of camaraderie?
Absolutely. Yeah, we share content. We work on content together. We've done different projects, statewide projects. We did a Vietnam War project a few years ago where each station did some different components of it. So we definitely work together, and we share the local content that we create. Now, local news, our Lakeland news really isn't of interest too much to other stations, although Almanac has grabbed a story from us once in a while if it's something that's important. But things like Common Ground, our Backroads series, are shared with other stations. A channel that we are called the Minnesota Channel, while that is put out by Twin Cities PBS, the content that's on that channel is provided by all the member stations of the Minnesota Public Television Association. So it's a collaboration, and it's an interesting channel. It carries House and Senate coverage during legislative session, but outside of that, it's mainly comprised of all programs from around the region.
So when you're kicking your feet up and enjoying retirement, what will you look back upon and glow with pride?
I was asked that question too, and one thing that popped in my mind initially was, some of the things that we've done, the building project and different things. But then, when I really reflected on it more, I think the thing that I'll have the warmest memories about are the people. People are what really make any organization. And I've been so fortunate, like I said, to have a really great board over the years. We've had wonderful staff, and I've met so many wonderful people in the business as well. In addition to that, our members, we've done a lot of different events. Unfortunately, we can't do much right now due to COVID, but, we've done concerts, and we've had people in, and we've done open houses and different things. And, the people that support public television are just wonderful people. And it's always a pleasure to visit with folks.
Indeed. There's a real esprit de corps here. So we often hear about the 80-20 rule in employment, where if you're lucky, you get to spend 80% of your time doing those things that you love, that you are really energized by, and 20% is spent on the stuff that you just got to do. So what was your ratio during your career, and what's the most onerous aspect of your job, Bill?
It's an interesting question. I think I'd have a hard time assigning percentages, but some of the things that I've loved to do is I've actually kind of enjoyed some of the advocacy things, visiting with folks about telling the story about Lakeland PBS and what we do and how we serve the region. Some of the things that are a little more onerous, and I think this is in any organization that receives some public funding, is some of the reporting is getting more and more complicated and more burdensome, and that gets a little old sometimes. But other things that's really enjoyable. I've always enjoyed technology. That's what I got started in the business in, and I'm still have the title of director of engineering, and it's not just a title. It's we're a small shop, so I get to go out and fix things once in a while. And earlier today, I was working on RFP for some antenna work and work at our Black Duck Tower. So I certainly have my hands in the technology as well, and that's a lot of fun. And then just working with the staff. We've got a great group of people, and really it's a family. It's a family organization, and they're all friends, and it's fun. So it's been difficult over COVID to not be in the office all the time with that group, and I'm looking forward to that. Spending a little time before I'm done here with the staff back in the office.
Well, you're an exemplary servant leader, without a doubt. I'm curious, when you think back, is there anything that was left undone that you wish you would have been able to accomplish?
I feel a little bit guilty that we're not doing a little bit more on the education front. I think we have such limited resources, and there are a lot of ways people can get educational content now. PBS has got some wonderful streaming resources and things that are being used in classrooms across the region, but I would have enjoyed having a little bit more impact in that area as of late. I think the focus has kind of moved away from that a little bit in public television. And when I talk education, I mean, K through 12 kinds of things. But, certainly all the programs that we air really do focus on education, and, whether it's Nova, Nature, Frontline, the core primetime type of programs. But, I think it's an area that we're starting to focus a little more on again, is education.
Since you've brought up those programs just there, I'm curious, what's your favorite PBS program?
Well, I'm kind of a science geek, so I like Nova a lot.
Right.
Frontline is a great program too. It's a little hard to watch sometimes, because they really dig into some things that are difficult, but I'm glad that they do that. But again, if I had to rate one, I'd say probably Nova.
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of difficult topics, one of the things I was interested to learn from you is, what role does public broadcasting have in addressing misinformation or disinformation? Of course, there's no shortage of either today.
I think that's one of the things I'm most proud about. When I look at programs like the NewsHour and Frontline, I think they do a really good job of providing very factual information on what's going on, and also our own local Lakeland news. I think Dennis and the crew do an awesome job of staying out of politics. I would be surprised if anybody could pick Dennis's political affiliation, and or the way that we cover stories. We get beat up a little bit from both sides, which, if you're getting it kind of equally from both sides, that feels
Sure.
about right, So,
Yeah.
but anytime you're providing news coverage, you're going to get a few stones thrown at you, but I feel pretty good that for the most part, people are very supportive of what we do locally. I do hear a little pushback sometimes too on some of the national news programming, but as being one way or the other a little bit. But I think overall, public media does a pretty good job of trying to cover things from the center.
Mm-hmm. Well, I wanted to bring up something I read in the national news this week about public broadcasting. It wasn't terribly flattering. There was a letter signed by filmmakers and producers around the country and sent to executives at PBS. And it basically called out PBS for a systemic failure to fulfill its mandate for a diversity of voices. And I was just curious, what role do local PBS stations have in fostering diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Well, I think it's something that's very important. And it's something that we struggle with, honestly. We've had lots of conversations about our staff. We've got a lot of white males on our staff, and we would love to be more diverse. We have a hard time getting minority applicants. In our news department, we've been fortunate to have had quite a few minority reporters that have joined us, and we appreciate that. But honestly, one area that we need to do a better job is, it would be awesome to have a Native American reporter, and we just can't seem to find anybody. We just don't get applicants along that line. I think Dennis and the crew work hard though, as far as coverage, of providing coverage for the tribes when they've got things going on. And, especially in our northern service area, Native American populations, probably about 25% of the people we serve up with our northern KAWE coverage area. It's less in central Minnesota, but still it's a significant number. So, the Native American population is something that's very important to us. And in fact, one of the channels that we air is First Nations Experience, and that is a channel that focuses exclusively on Indigenous populations.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like locally we're doing a great deal to rectify that situation.
Well, I think we could always do better, but it's certainly something we're aware of, and it's something that we make a definite effort to get out and make sure that we're providing coverage to that group of people as well.
What's something that most people don't know about public broadcasting?
Boy, that's an interesting question, that don't know about public broadcasting.
I think a lot of people have perceptions of public broadcasting and preconceived notions possibly, and I'm just curious, what's something that people don't realize, perhaps?
I wonder how many people realize what I talked about earlier, the fact that the station isn't really owned by anybody. I think some people think that it's owned by the board or something. It's not. It's the property of the community.
Sure.
There's no assets that could be sold here, then somebody's going to get rich. When I leave, I have no vested interest in the organization. I'm just an employee, and the board are volunteers. So I think the community can be proud of that. It's something that they own. So when they invest in it, they're investing in their community.
So you've been CEO since 2000, if I'm not mistaken. And I'm curious, tell us a couple stories of impact. When did you realize the profound impact and the broad impact that public broadcasting was having in our region? A couple stories of impact.
Yeah, one thing that kind of came to mind is if you remember back when there was this may be prior to your time even, but a long time ago, there was some major flooding going on in East Grand Forks, and the whole town was burning and shut down. And we ended up getting a hold of a VHS tape that somebody had shot where I think it was the police had taken a boat and went up and down the streets. And I remember airing that VHS tape one evening. We basically aired a couple tapes, and it was, 2 or 3 hours, and people could actually see their homes. And just things like that where, you're providing a service that is really important, and our local news in general, some of the things that we do with that, and the program that you do, Currents, just covering events and things that are going on in the community, and just shining a spotlight on some of these things. I think those kinds of things are really important. And we heard back, specifically on that flood event, we got such positive feedback on that, and people just so appreciated having some outlet, some way to get that information out to people. So I think being a local broadcaster and really providing local content is really important. And I think that's where, that's what'll keep broadcast, whether it's commercial or non-commercial, viable long-term. Is, there are so many ways to get the national content now, and even national PBS type of programming. But local programs like our Common Ground, Currents, Lakeland News, Backroads, different things, those kinds of things shine a light on our area and our region, and I think that has impact.
Bill, I learned that you're also the principal at Sanford Communications, and it raised the question, where does Sanford Communications end and public broadcasting, Lakeland public broadcasting, begin? Well,
Sanford Communications is something that really is pretty much done at this point. I did more back when I was not the CEO. I wrote some software, I designed some hardware for radio automation. It was a creative outlet for me, I think, and ended up coming up with a few products that people were interested in.
So I'm not sure if everyone realizes that originally Lakeland was on the Bemidji State University campus, and you led the charge on this station that we currently are in. Can you tell us a little bit about that saga?
Yeah, first I want to say that the partnership that we had with Bemidji State University and still have, uh, we so appreciate Bemidji State. They were our home for a lot of years. Um, the reason that we ended up looking at moving off campus is we were just running out of space. We had a small space in Deputy Hall. We had a studio there. We had some offices that were in Bangsburg Hall, but we got to the point where we had people pretty much stacked on top of each other. Um, when we moved, we were in the same amount of space that we had when we started. When we started, we had 8 people. When we moved, we had over 20 people on staff. Plus just a lot more technology. As I mentioned when we talked earlier about, our broadcast, we had one channel that was on for not 24 hours. When we moved, we had 6 channels that were on the air 24/7. We were doing local news. We were doing a lot of local content. So we just really outgrew the space, and there just wasn't additional space for us at Bemidji State. So we needed to find a new home. And, we were very fortunate. We did receive some bonding funding. We had great business support. A lot of donors helped make this happen. The Nielsen Foundation was awesome. They provided one of the initial gifts that helped get us started, and they were very thoughtful in the way that they provided that gift. It was contingent upon us getting some bonding funding. So we were able to go to the state and say, look, if we don't receive the funding, we're going to lose this $400,000 from the Nielsen Foundation. So it just all worked out really well. It was just a lot of fun. It was tough. It was a stretch to do that. But Jason, I can probably say that when we moved into this building, we moved in with everything paid for and no debt, which is
Remarkable.
which is pretty amazing. Yeah.
Indeed.
Speaks to the
Bill,
generosity of people in the region.
Here, 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 here. 35 years is a long term of service. I'm curious, how do you think that public broadcasting will change over the course of the next 35 years? What are your hopes and fears for public broadcasting?
Well, I guess my hopes are that it continues, that they continue to provide relevant local and regional and national programming that people will support. And I don't see that as being a problem. In fact, the direction that I see happening with commercial television, and I'm not going to throw stones at commercial television. I think there's some good things to watch. I enjoy some things on commercial television.
Sure.
But there's a lot of things that they just don't go into. Their focus for kids programming is selling toys and cereal. It isn't about educating kids. So it's just a different focus. Like I said, the mission of public television is really to serve. It isn't to generate a profit. Where commercial entities, commercial radio and commercial television, they certainly provide some local service with their local news and things like that, but their focus is to generate a profit for the owners. That's the bottom line. So it's completely different than public television.
Well, Bill, I want to thank you for your years of leadership and service. And of course, thank you so much for taking time out of your day today to visit with me.
Well, thank you, Jason. You do a great job with this program, and we so appreciate you as well. So thank you.
And thank all of you for joining me once again. I'm Jason Edens, your host of Lakeland Currents. Be kind and be well. We'll see you next week.